London, summer of 1992. On one warm July morning, a young mother set out for a walk to the city park with her little son. Wanting to avoid the midday heat, they purposely headed out early. Enjoying the morning coolness, they peacefully strolled along a cozy park path beside a stream. But suddenly their idyll was shattered by the appearance of a stranger. This was Rachel Nickell, a native of London, born in 1968. An attractive and gifted girl, she dreamed of a modeling career from a young age and, thanks to her persistence and excellent looks, achieved that goal. At age 20, she was already participating in London Fashion Week, although her success on the runway proved short-lived. In 1989, Rachel met a Spaniard named Andre, and soon became pregnant. Realizing her situation, she understood that she would have to forget about her modeling career for at least a few years. In 1990, their son Alexander was born. The parents weren't in a hurry to formalize their relationship officially, but they lived in harmony. Andre had a good income, so Rachel could afford not to go to work. She fully devoted herself to motherhood and housekeeping. The family settled in a cozy apartment in southwest London, near Wimbledon Common Park. They even got a dog named Molly and enjoyed a quiet family life. The morning of July 15, 1992 was sunny and windless. Forecasters promised real heat. So 23-year-old Rachel went for her daily walk earlier than usual. Taking 2-year-old Alexander and faithful Molly with her, they headed to the park to get some fresh air. Wimbledon Common is a sizable green space, about 4 square kilometers in area. In summer, during vacation season, it gets quite crowded, but in the morning the park was nearly empty. I remember the bright sunlight and pleasant warmth. The park was bursting with flowers and greenery, Molly happily running in the grass, the adult Alexander later recalled. Unfortunately, what should have been a pleasant family outing instantly turned into a horrible tragedy that traumatized the boy for life. According to Alexander, a man suddenly jumped out of the bushes with a large black bag over his shoulder. He rushed towards them with a knife in his hand. Alexander was shoved and fell, and a moment later his mother collapsed on the ground next to him. The park gradually filled with people, but the mother and son were found only an hour and a half later. Around 10:30 a.m., passers-by saw the toddler crying bitterly, clinging to his mother's motionless body. "Mommy, wake up! Mommy, why won't you get up?" the boy sobbed. One look was enough to understand that the son would not get an answer from his mother. The woman's clothes were stained with something red. Completing the gruesome picture was a paper receipt from a store lying on her forehead. As it turned out later, Alexander himself had put it there. The day before, Rachel had told him about bandages, and the toddler thought he could help his mom with this band-aid. Even seasoned detectives were stunned by the brutality of the crime. Rachel was attacked in a deserted spot near the stream. She was stabbed 49 times in the neck and torso and subjected to sexual assault. It was shocking that such a monstrous crime occurred in broad daylight in a public place. Initially, investigators assumed that the attacker knew the victim and acted according to a plan. But it quickly became clear this was not the case. First, Rachel usually walked in the park at a different time. Second, the police could not find a single suspect among her acquaintances. The young woman lived a quiet, orderly life, devoted mainly to raising her son. Her common-law husband had a wonderful relationship with her. Although Rachel hadn't appeared on the runway for several years, she remained very attractive and drew men's attention. Perhaps one of her fans felt spurned and decided to take revenge? The only lead for the investigation was the perpetrator's genetic material found at the scene of the tragedy. Experts were able to compile his DNA profile, but in the early 90s the database was nearly empty and cross-referencing yielded no results. Law enforcement interviewed about 500 potential witnesses who were in the park between 9 and 11 a.m. But only one of them provided important information. Around 9:30, he noticed a suspicious man washing his hands in the stream and then wiping his jacket. Slung over his shoulder was the same black bag that Alexander remembered. Thanks to this testimony, the police made a composite sketch: a young man, about 180 centimeters tall, with short brown hair. However, despite the stranger's odd behavior, there were insufficient grounds to link him to the crime. In fact, the only direct witness to the tragedy was 2-year-old Alexander, who, due to his age, could not provide the investigation with any useful information. However, after the high-profile murder, journalists showed increased interest in the boy, even trying to interview him on the playground. Rachel's common-law husband, Andre, had a cast-iron alibi. At the time of the crime, he was at work. After the tragedy, he decided to leave the country and return with his son to his homeland, Spain. Several months passed, and investigators managed to narrow the circle of suspects. Suspicion fell on 26-year-old Colin Stagg, a resident of southwest London, who was often seen walking his dog in Wimbledon Common Park. That fateful morning, Colin woke up around 8:30 with a terrible headache. He decided that a walk with his dog in the park would cheer him up. But he didn't feel better, so instead of going to work, the man returned home and went back to bed. Waking up a few hours later, he again set off to the park with his dog. To his great surprise, the place he had passed by in the morning was now surrounded by police. Colin honestly admitted to the officer that he had walked along that path around 9 in the morning but hadn't noticed anything suspicious. Stagg could have been forgotten about, if not for one incident from his past. Colin had once been fined £200 for indecent behavior in the park, namely for being caught there without clothes. So now he was back in the police's sights. Despite the complete lack of physical evidence linking Colin Stagg to the murder of Rachel Nickell, he became the focus of the investigation. The famous criminal psychologist Paul Britton was even brought in to compile a psychological profile of the killer. In his report, Britton suggested that the criminal most likely did not know the victim personally, but chose her at random while hiding in the bushes near the path. According to his assessment, the killer was likely to be between 20 and 35 years old, modest and unsociable, with difficulties in communication, especially with women. It's unlikely he has a wife or steady girlfriend willing to indulge his unusual fantasies. It was this that pushed him to commit the crime: unrealized desires and suffering from loneliness, the psychologist wrote. Police compared the profile compiled by Britton with Colin Stagg's personality. Much of it matched: age, lack of serious relationships, living near the park, and daily walks with his dog. But this circumstantial evidence was insufficient for an arrest. To obtain more compelling evidence, Colin was called in for questioning. While talking to detectives, Stagg admitted that he had seen Rachel in the park once. He liked her, so he remembered her face. Colin also said that he had never had a long-term relationship, and this was a painful subject for him. These confessions only heightened the investigators' suspicions, but still did not give them legal grounds to charge Stagg. So the detectives decided to lure him into a trap. A special operation called Ineus was devised. The key role was given to a female police officer, Lizzie James, who worked undercover. Her task was to get close to Stagg, gain his trust, and get him to confess to the crime against Rachel Nickell. Lizzie constantly consulted with a criminal psychologist, who advised her on tactics for communicating with the suspect. For 5 months, Lizzie developed a relationship with the unsuspecting Colin. They went on dates, talked on the phone, and corresponded. The woman hinted at her interest in the occult and unusual experiments. In one of her letters, she directly asked Colin if he wanted to act out any of his fantasies. He replied in the affirmative and even shared some frightening and cruel ideas. However, no matter how much Lizzie tried to extract information from him about the crime in the park, Stagg evaded answering. Finally, the female police officer took a desperate step. During a personal meeting, she promised Colin in exchange for confessing to the murder of Rachel Nickell. "I'm very sorry, but I didn't do it. I didn't cause Rachel any harm," was Stagg's categorical response. Despite this, as well as the lack of reliable evidence, Colin Stagg was arrested in 1993. Police had recordings of phone conversations where he told Lizzie that he enjoyed causing pain to others. Moreover, while discussing the park tragedy, Colin described in detail the place by the stream where the murder took place, providing details known only to the real killer. The trial began in September 1994. In protest against the unfounded accusations, Colin went on a hunger strike. During the hearings, he was exhausted and had lost a lot of weight. In his speech, Stagg stated, "Most of what I wrote and told Lizzie is untrue. I made up a lot because I liked her, and I didn't want to disappoint the only woman who, I thought, was genuinely interested in me. In reality, I don't enjoy cruel things and have never done anything like that. And I'm certainly not capable of what happened to Rachel Nickell." After hearing the arguments of the prosecution and defense, the judge concluded that the police had acted too zealously in trying to beat a confession out of Stagg using dubious methods. The court ruled that Colin Stagg was not involved in the park tragedy, and he was released right in the courtroom. In 2002, a decade after the tragic events, Scotland Yard's investigative team reopened the case. But the real breakthrough came only 4 years later, when the DNA sample found at the crime scene was finally identified. The genetic material belonged to a convicted killer named Robert Napper. By the time officers tracked down Robert Napper in 2006, he was already 40. The man had serious mental disorders, paranoid schizophrenia and autism spectrum disorders. For more than 10 years he had been held in a secure psychiatric facility. Back in November 1993, Napper had been convicted of murdering 27-year-old Samantha Bissett and her young daughter Jasmine. As it turned out, before the attack, Robert had been stalking Samantha for several weeks. He was especially attracted to peeping through windows at her life. Napper memorized the poses and movements in which Samantha made love with her partner. And then one night, having waited for the right moment, he broke into the woman's house through the balcony doors, which were almost never locked. Without going into the grisly details of the crime, I'll just say that Samantha and Jasmine endured real torture. At the end, Robert placed Samantha's body in the pose he had most often seen during her lovemaking with her husband. Even seasoned officers, examining the crime scene, could not restrain their emotions and needed the help of a psychologist. They had not yet encountered such shocking cruelty. The murder of Samantha and her daughter occurred 16 months after the attack on model Rachel Nickell. Robert Napper was born in 1966 in London. His father was a driving instructor, and his mother was a caregiver in a nursing home. Conflicts often arose in the family in front of the children. In addition to Robert, the couple had 2 younger sons and a daughter. When the boy was 9, his father left the family and went to Australia, where he got a job as a firefighter. Robert took the separation very hard. He wrote letters to his father, but after a while, contact between them broke off. According to his father's recollections, as a child, Robert was a very sweet boy, and nothing foreshadowed that he would be capable of terrible acts in the future. At school, Napper had almost no friends and always kept to himself. He was very withdrawn and passionate about astronomy. Classmates recalled that Robert seemed to live in his own world. His mother told how he would eavesdrop on her conversations with relatives, hiding behind doors, and then run out and accuse everyone of gossiping about him. The boy behaved aggressively, often lied, and fought with his brothers. Robert loved to spy on his sister when she was taking a shower or changing clothes in her room. Sometimes he would throw back the covers from the sleeping girl and stare at her body for hours. His mother noticed her son's strange behavior and suspected that something was wrong with his mind. At the age of 11, at his mother's insistence, Robert underwent a psychiatric evaluation. After the very first session, he came home and announced with a smile, "The doctor thinks I'm crazy." Napper was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome and prescribed appropriate treatment. The following year, 12-year-old Robert became a victim of He was walking in the park with 2 younger friends when an unknown man attacked them and forced the boys to have This incident happened very close to Napper's house. Psychologists believe that it was then that a turning point occurred, after which Robert himself began to resort to. A teacher recalled how, after this incident, the boy changed dramatically, lost the ability to show emotions and feelings, and turned into a soulless robot. Napper just sat at his desk, mechanically did his assignments, and went home without showing any emotion. Once in literature class, students were played an audio recording of a story from the Victorian era, which was about a murder. While listening to the story, Robert turned terribly pale, began to shake, and broke out in a cold sweat. The teacher suspected an epileptic seizure, but soon it passed. On one occasion, Robert stole money from his uncle. His mother turned to the police, asking them to take her son to the station, fingerprint him, and have a preventive talk with him as if he were a criminal. She hoped that this would frighten the boy and force him to come to his senses. But she was mistaken. Neighbors and acquaintances considered Robert a sweet and quite normal teenager. But behind closed doors, he was completely different. Napper had average mental abilities and showed no inclination for physical labor. At the age of 16, Robert dropped out of school, acquired basic skills in catering, and got a job as a laborer. He constantly changed jobs, never staying anywhere for long. There were periods when he would idle for months, not leaving his room. Meanwhile, his mother remarried. From the very beginning, Robert disliked his stepfather, provoked conflicts, and even refused to talk to him. By the age of 18, his behavior had become so unbearable that I simply told him, "You have to leave my house." Robert left, and for 5 whole years I didn't see my son, his mother recalled. Their next meeting took place only in 1989. At that time, Robert was renting a shabby room in South London. During the conversation, he confessed to his mother that 2 months earlier he had a girl in the park. The woman did not know whether to believe her son's words or take it as a bad joke. She contacted Robert's psychiatrist and also reported the incident to the police. Law enforcement conducted an investigation but found no record of at park. Strangely, the officers did not even try to interrogate Napper himself or at least talk to him. If they had taken a sample of his DNA then, the Rachel Nickell case could have been solved much earlier. At about 20 years of age, Robert was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, which was rapidly progressing. He sincerely believed that he was an outstanding mathematician and even a Nobel laureate. Napper was convinced that he had access to some kind of superpowers, enormous wealth, and the ability to communicate telepathically. It seemed to him that he was invulnerable to justice. Of course, all this was nothing more than the product of his sick imagination. Robert's first known victim was a 31-year-old young mother sunbathing in a swimsuit in her own garden. After the attack, mockingly advised her, "Never leave the back door unlocked." This happened in 1989. Over the next 2 years, Napper honed his criminal craft, following a clear pattern. Detectives could not track him down. As a rule, he hunted for victims in deserted corners of the park. The attacker chose young and attractive women, mostly blondes. It is noteworthy that the site of several attacks was the same place where Robert himself had been subjected to at the age of 12. According to police estimates, between 1989 and 1993, Napper committed at least 90 attacks on women. Despite his short stature, he was in excellent physical shape. Robert always carried a knife and rope with him, although he did not always use them. At home he kept a gun. With each subsequent crime, Napper became more brutal and sadistic in his actions. After the murder of Samantha Bissett and her daughter Jasmine, Robert's fingerprint was found in their home. This helped track down the criminal, who at the time was working as a loader. In May 1994, 28-year-old Napper was detained and convicted a year later. However, he was found not guilty by reason of insanity and sent not to prison, but to a high-security psychiatric clinic. It later emerged that during the investigation into the murder of Rachel Nickell, Napper had come to the attention of detectives as a potential suspect, but due to his short stature, he was quickly excluded from the list, since a witness had seen a tall man in the park. Important detail: at the time of the search for Rachel's killer, Robert Napper was already in a psychiatric hospital behind bars. It was there that a detective interrogated him. The criminal confessed and provided such details that only the real killer could know. Since Napper was already serving a life sentence in a psychiatric clinic, the case of Rachel Nickell's murder was simply closed without a separate verdict. The court found Robert a danger to society and ordered that he be kept in a closed medical facility for the rest of his life. Andre, Rachel's common-law husband, initially thought about returning from Spain to England, but eventually decided to stay in his homeland. A few years later, he married, giving Alexander a stepmother and stepsisters. The adult Alexander once said in an interview, "Journalists predicted various horrors for me. They said I would withdraw into myself, go crazy, become a tramp, and even follow in Napper's footsteps. Fortunately, they were all wrong. Thanks to the support of my father and relatives, I found my path in life." According to him, memories of that tragic day in the London park were forever etched in his memory. To cope with the psychological trauma, Alexander took up meditation and later became a yoga instructor. He wrote a book about his mother and the difficult life he had to live. This book helped him accept the past and even forgive Robert Napper. Colin Stagg, who was once groundlessly accused of murdering Rachel Nickell, went to court demanding compensation for the suffering he endured. He won the case and received compensation in the amount of £700,000 sterling. Thank you for watching this story. Write your thoughts about it in the comments. Don't miss the future videos, subscribe and like the channel. Take care of yourself and people you love.